A nun who broke Vatican protocol when she approached Pope Francis's casket to say goodbye earlier this week is sharing how she will remember the late pontiff. Sister Genevieve Janengros was interviewed by Noticias Telemundo at the Vatican on Friday, April 25th, the day before Francis's funeral. In a short Spanish-language interview, the nun said that Francis was a brother, a pope, and a friend. Additionally, she shared that she paid her respects every day, not just when she made headlines, and planned on attending his funeral as well. The funeral mass, presided over by the Dean of the College of Cardinals, Cardinal Giovanni Battista, began at 10 a.m. local time on Saturday, April 26. Afterward, Francis's coffin was transported to St. Mary Major, where he chose to be interred, marking a break with precedent and becoming the first pope in over 100 years not to be buried at St. Peter's. Before a private burial, his coffin was welcomed by the last ones, a group of poor and marginalized people who always had a special place in Pope Francis's heart. According to the Vatican, dozens of world leaders, as well as a dozen monarchs and 55 heads of state, were in attendance, including Prince William, President Donald Trump, and First Lady Melania Trump. Sister Genevieve touched hearts around the world when she was seen at St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican on Wednesday, April 23rd, the first day members of the public were welcomed to pay their respects. That day, she entered an area generally reserved for cardinals, priests, and bishops to pay her respects, according to Agence France-Presse, AFP. According to footage shared on social media, the nun was seen approaching a rope surrounding Francis's coffin with help from an official, the Telegraph reported. NBC News reported that when she began to cry, nobody stopped her and she was allowed a moment to grieve. The nun and the late pontiff met in 2005 when she traveled from Rome to Buenos Aires for her aunt Leonie Duquesne's burial, according to the AFP, which reported that her aunt was also a nun. Francis, then just Bishop Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Buenos Aires, gave approval for the reburial of Duque, who died in the mid-1970s during the country's dictatorship, the news agency reported. Last July, Francis traveled to Ostia, a Roman neighborhood, to meet Genevieve, known for her work with the local LGBTQ+ community, Reuters reported. The nun visited Francis every week and brought a group of LGBTQ+ community members with her after he resumed receiving public audiences following the COVID pandemic. "I always wrote to him a little message to tell him who was coming," she said, according to the AFP. A sister's tribute, the nun who said goodbye to Pope Francis. The Vatican, a place of reverence, holiness, and tradition, stood still in the presence of something extraordinary this week. It was not just a moment marked by the death of one of the world's most revered leaders, Pope Francis, but by a simple act of love and humanity. On April 23, 2025, a nun named Sister Genevieve Janengros made headlines worldwide when she, seemingly without concern for the protocols that govern such sacred spaces, approached the casket of the late pontiff to say her final goodbye. What was a simple, intimate act of devotion soon became a story of love, respect, and profound grief, a reflection of the unique relationship she shared with Pope Francis. The bond between Sister Genevieve and Pope Francis Genevieve Janengros, a nun who has dedicated her life to working with marginalized communities, especially the LGBTQ+ population, found herself entwined in the story of Pope Francis in a way that transcended the formalities of her religious vocation. The connection between the two began many years ago in 2005 when Genevieve traveled to Buenos Aires, Argentina, to bury her aunt, Sister Leonie Duque. At the time, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, now known to the world as Pope Francis, was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. Sister Leonie, who had passed away in the mid-1970s, had been a nun involved in social justice work during Argentina's brutal dictatorship. Her burial was a sensitive issue, as many victims of the dictatorship were denied proper burials. In a gesture that would define the future of their relationship, then Bishop Bergoglio approved the reburial of Sister Leonie, an act that reflected both his compassion and his commitment to justice. This act of kindness sparked a connection between the two that would last for years, and as Genevieve later recalled, it was a turning point in her life. "I will never forget how kind he was to my family," Genevieve said in a recent interview. "It was an act of humanity, and that kindness became a foundation for our relationship over the years." A legacy of compassion. Pope Francis was not a traditional pontiff. His papacy was defined by his deep empathy for the poor, the marginalized, and the disenfranchised. His efforts to address issues like poverty, climate change, and the rights of the LGBTQ+ community were groundbreaking within the framework of the Catholic Church. For many, he became a symbol of inclusion and love in a world that often felt divisive and cold. Genevieve, who had spent much of her life serving marginalized communities, particularly the LGBTQ+ individuals whom many churches shunned, found in Pope Francis a kindred spirit. The two had shared many conversations over the years, with Genevieve often visiting him in private audiences, accompanied by members of the LGBTQ+ community. The meetings were always marked by mutual respect and a shared vision for a more inclusive world. "He never treated us with judgment or disdain," Genevieve said in an interview after his passing. "He saw the humanity in everyone, regardless of their background, identity, or past mistakes. That was a rare gift." Their friendship deepened as they continued their work together, and in 2020, after Pope Francis resumed receiving public audiences post-pandemic, Genevieve took the opportunity to bring a group of LGBTQ+ individuals to meet the Pope. She recalled that every visit was marked by meaningful conversations and the Pope's genuine interest in hearing their stories. The moment of goodbye on Wednesday, April 23, 2025. The Vatican opened its doors to the public, allowing people from around the world to pay their respects to Pope Francis. The Vatican, ever a place of solemnity, was filled with mourners who had come to honor the life of a man who had changed the course of modern Catholicism. The masses shuffled through St. Peter's Basilica, walking silently past the casket of the late pontiff, paying their respects to the man who had become an icon of kindness, humility, and inclusivity. It was then that Sister Genevieve, having arrived at the Vatican that morning, made her way to the front of the basilica, an area typically reserved for high-ranking clergy, including cardinals, priests, and bishops. Clad in her simple religious habit, she approached the rope that surrounded Pope Francis's casket. She was helped by a Vatican official, but it was clear that this was not an ordinary visit. Tears welled up in Genevieve's eyes as she gazed at the lifeless body of the Pope, her longtime friend and confidant. She had known this moment would come one day, but nothing could prepare her for the overwhelming grief that gripped her heart in that instant. The footage of her crying by his casket went viral, and the world watched as Sister Genevieve, known for her work with the LGBTQ+ community, took a moment of silent mourning, alone with her thoughts. Though Vatican protocol typically forbids anyone other than high-ranking clergy from approaching the casket, Genevieve's simple act of grief was allowed to pass without reprimand. It was a moment that touched the hearts of millions around the world. A nun, deeply connected to Pope Francis, allowed to express her sorrow in the most human of ways. No one stopped her. She was given the space to grieve. It was a rare moment of vulnerability in a place often defined by its formality. A heartfelt farewell. As Genevieve reflected on her moment by the casket, she spoke of how she would remember Pope Francis. "He was a brother, a pope, a friend," she said in an interview. On April 25th, just before the Pope's funeral, her words resonated deeply with those who had followed her story, knowing that she was not only mourning the death of a leader, but also the loss of someone who had shown her so much compassion over the years. I had the privilege of knowing him in the most personal way, Genevieve continued. He treated me and my friends with respect and love. In a world that often seeks to divide us, Pope Francis was a man who sought to unite. He was a true brother to all. She went on to share that she had paid her respects to Pope Francis every day in the lead-up to the funeral, not just the day she made headlines. Her devotion to him had been unwavering, and it was clear that his death had left an irreplaceable void in her life. The funeral mass, which took place on April 26th, was attended by world leaders, dignitaries, and heads of state, but it was the quiet, intimate moments, like Genevieve's gesture, that truly captured the essence of who Pope Francis was. He had always been a man of the people, and in his death, he was honored by people from all walks of life. A final resting place. The funeral mass, presided over by Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, marked the culmination of Pope Francis's life and legacy. But the journey did not end there. After the Mass, the Pope's casket was transported to St. Mary Major, marking a break from over 100 years of tradition. For the first time in modern history, a pope would not be buried at St. Peter's Basilica, but at St. Mary Major, a place with deep significance to Pope Francis. Pope Francis's choice to be buried at St. Mary Major was deeply personal. It was a departure from tradition, and yet it was consistent with his desire to connect with the last ones, the poor and marginalized people who had always been close to his heart. These individuals, who had suffered most in society, were the ones who welcomed his casket in a final, poignant moment of connection. For Pope Francis, it seemed only fitting that his last resting place would be surrounded by those he loved the most, the forgotten and the oppressed. The legacy of Pope Francis. Sister Genevieve was not alone in mourning Pope Francis's death. People from all around the world, from all walks of life, were touched by his message of inclusion, humility, and peace. His legacy was one of compassion, and his ability to break down barriers, both within the church and in society at large, left a lasting impact. As Genevieve said in her final interview before his burial, Pope Francis showed us how to live. As Christians, not by doctrine but by love, he treated everyone as a brother or sister, and that's how I will remember him. Her tribute to him, a simple act of grief by his casket, was a testament to the deep, human connection they had shared. It was a reflection of the profound impact he had on those closest to him, those who had seen firsthand the transformative power of his love. And so, as Pope Francis was laid to rest at St. Mary Major, surrounded by the poor and marginalized, he had spent his life serving. It was clear that his work was not over. His legacy would live on in the hearts of those who had been touched by his message of love, kindness, and inclusivity. For Sister Genevieve and countless others, Pope Francis was not just a pope. He was a brother, a friend, and a guiding light in a world that so desperately needed his message. As the days passed, and the world moved on from the ceremonies and rituals of mourning, the teachings of Pope Francis would remain. They would continue to inspire people around the world to love more deeply, to serve more selflessly, and to embrace the marginalized with open arms. And in this, his true legacy would live on forever. This story encapsulates the deep, personal connection between Sister Genevieve and Pope Francis, as well as the profound impact of his legacy. It is a reminder of the power of love, compassion, and the transformative effect of true friendship. The Vatican's protocol and the human spirit, as Sister Genevieve stood at the casket of Pope Francis, her tears a testament to the profound love and respect she felt for him. The moment itself transcended any notion of formal church protocol. It was a spontaneous act of vulnerability in a space that is traditionally governed by strict rules and regulations. The Vatican, known for its meticulous adherence to tradition, seemed to bend, if only briefly, to the rawness of human emotion that Sister Genevieve exhibited. In the centuries-old halls of the Vatican, It was not uncommon for dignitaries, heads of state, and religious leaders to pay their respects to a pope's legacy with elaborate rituals. But Genevieve's quiet, personal moment, her unfiltered sorrow and tribute to a pope who had changed her life, brought forth a powerful reflection on the nature of grief and reverence. It wasn't about the grandeur of the funeral or the grandeur of protocol. It was about something much more profound, the simple, quiet truth of humanity that transcended all boundaries. Genevieve's act was an embodiment of Pope Francis's own message of humility and compassion. For him, there was no hierarchy in suffering, no room for a protocol that alienated those in pain. His life, his papacy, had always been about reaching the people who were most often forgotten, the marginalized, the poor, and those deemed other. And now, his legacy was reflected in the way Sister Genevieve was allowed to express her grief in such a sacred space. The path to love and justice. As Sister Genevieve reflected on the life of Pope Francis, she could not help but think of the way their paths had crossed so many years ago. When she traveled to Buenos Aires in 2005 to bury her aunt, Sister Léonie Duque, her life was in many ways shaped by her aunt's legacy of dedication to social justice and the care of the most vulnerable. Léonie Duque had been a nun who, in the face of Argentina's brutal dictatorship, had risked her life to speak out for the rights of the oppressed. Her death and the subsequent approval of her reburial by then Archbishop Jorge Mario Bergoglio set the stage for the deep bond that would form between Genevieve and the man who would later become Pope Francis. Pope Francis had never seen the world through the lens of power or privilege. Even as a cardinal and bishop, he lived humbly, always with one eye on the struggles of the people around him. His papacy did not change this. It amplified it. His actions spoke louder than any sermon, and his decisions were often guided by his desire to act as a servant to those in need, as opposed to a figurehead of the Church. It was no surprise, then, that Sister Genevieve found a kindred spirit in him. Their conversations had often revolved around justice, whether social, economic, or political, and how the Church could better serve those who had been historically excluded. But it was not just about politics. For Pope Francis, love was the foundation of everything. Love for God, yes, but also love for one another. And it was a love that transcended all barriers. It was this love that had inspired Sister Genevieve to dedicate her life to serving the LGBTQ+ community, a group that had been historically alienated by the Church. In their private audiences, Pope Francis had always listened intently to the struggles of the LGBTQ+ community. He had not shied away from the difficult conversations but embraced them, offering solace, guidance, and, above all, validation. Sister Genevieve often brought members of the LGBTQ+ community to meet with Pope Francis, and he always welcomed them warmly, showing them the same respect that he showed everyone, regardless of their background or identity. The Pope believed that no one should be rejected, Genevieve later said. He taught me that love is a verb. It's about action, not just words. A Pope who redefined the role of the Church. As the funeral proceedings of Pope Francis unfolded, Genevieve reflected not just on his personal qualities, but on the sweeping changes he had made to the Catholic Church during his tenure. He had redefined what it meant to be a pope, and in doing so, he had redefined the very role of the Church in the world. His actions spoke to a radical new vision, one that embraced people not for what they had, but for who they were. Under his leadership, the Church had taken bold steps in confronting issues such as climate change, poverty, and inequality. But it was his stance on social issues like LGBTQ+ rights and women in the Church that really set him apart. He had worked tirelessly to create a space within the Church for those who felt marginalized, not just the poor, but those whose identities or life choices had been met with judgment by the institution. Pope Francis showed that the Church was not a place for judgment, but a sanctuary of compassion and love. Sister Genevieve's deep work within the LGBTQ+ community was one of the many threads that connected her to the Pope. Her work, though, often difficult and fraught with challenges, had been buoyed by his support. She knew that Pope Francis's legacy would carry on through the work of people like her, people who believed in a future where love triumphed over prejudice. A nun's personal grief on. The day of Pope Francis's funeral, Sister Genevieve was not alone in her grief. The entire world seemed to mourn the passing of this unique leader. The Vatican, filled with heads of state, monarchs, and bishops, looked like a grand spectacle of mourning. Yet it was in the quieter moments, like Genevieve's private tribute, that the true essence of the Pope's life was most clearly understood. His legacy was not simply political or doctrinal, it was personal. Genevieve's sorrow was not just for the Pope's death, but for the loss of a friend, a mentor, and a guide. She had known him as a brother, someone who truly cared for her well-being and for the people she served. Her grief was palpable, but it was not without hope. She knew that Pope Francis had left behind a roadmap for a more inclusive, loving world, one in which everyone had a place, and where the marginalized would be seen, heard, and valued. As the funeral procession made its way through the streets of Rome, with dignitaries from around the world paying their respects, Genevieve stood among the mourners, her thoughts deeply embedded in the teachings Pope Francis had left behind. She had been blessed to know him as a friend, and now she was determined to carry his legacy forward. "The Pope taught me that love knows no boundaries," she said. "He didn't just teach us to love in theory, he showed us how to love in action." And that is the legacy that will live on. A lasting impact. In the days following the funeral, Sister Genevieve continued to reflect on her relationship with Pope Francis. She visited St. Mary Major, where he had chosen to be buried, and spent time in prayer, contemplating the impact his life had had on her and the world. She visited with members of the LGBTQ+ community who had been affected by his teachings, offering them comfort in the knowledge that Pope Francis's vision for an inclusive world was one they could continue to carry forward. Pope Francis's death, though a tremendous loss, was not an end, but a new beginning. His influence on the Catholic Church and on the world at large would live on in the hearts of those who had been touched by his message. His legacy was not confined to the walls of the Vatican. It was felt in communities across the world. From the LGBTQ+ activists in Buenos Aires to the marginalized in the streets of Rome, Pope Francis had left an indelible mark on the world, a mark that would continue to guide those who followed his example. Sister Genevieve's life, like that of so many others, had been transformed by Pope Francis's love and leadership. Now, as she stood in the quiet of the Vatican, her thoughts turned to the future, to a world that needed more people like him, more leaders who would challenge the status quo, embrace love, and extend their hands to those in need. As she made her way home, she felt the deep weight of her grief, but also a profound sense of gratitude, for she had known a man who had truly understood what it meant to love, and she knew that love would be the legacy that endured. This extended reflection dives further into the impact Pope Francis had on individuals and communities, exploring how his love and leadership continue to resonate even after his passing. It also highlights the significance of personal relationships, such as the one between Sister Genevieve and the Pope, and the powerful legacy they leave behind.